everybody. Welcome to our last week of term one. Yeah. Only 5 more sleeps till holidays. Yeah. Well, in holidays, you just won't know what to do, will you? You won't know what to do with yourself.
Never.
You do have an essay to write, of course, or research, and I'll get you the question for that. I can print it off today. I mean, I've sort of described it, but it's good to get the wording. So, you know, you'll be sitting there without anything to do, so I'm going to suggest you have a look at the moodle. And what I'd like to explore for a little while today, we've talked a bit about the media and sources of information. And in your essay, you've explored the whole idea of finding quality information, reliable information, ethos, isn't it? Ethos, credibility, reliability. We don't say believability, we have to say credibility. Cred means believe. Credit. Credit's about believing someone will pay you back, so you give them credit. Okay. So, credibility. Now, let's look at this more broadly across media. So this is kind of connected with critical reading. And as I've said, reading, it does involve micro-strategies within the text. And things like, for example, you know now, first sentence of each paragraph should capture the main idea. I mean, writing obviously links with reading, the tricks of writing. A good writer should be writing like that, in certain genres anyway. So as a reader, are you alert to those? So we've looked at some strategies around reading and finding key information and, you know, critical thinking of argument and so on. We've been exploring that. You've been developing your vocabulary. But I've also talked about the macro. You know, being out wider. The wider framework informs the micro. So I want to look at this broader framework today and some choices. So let's go to software, the Moodle. What I want to look at is, so there's a whole, it didn't work at all. Okay. Okay, have a look at the screen then. We'll do it this way. Okay, reading. We won't look at that now. We'll look at, go down to media. Media resources. Okay, media obviously shapes the way people think, shapes the way I think, shapes the way you think. You know, how do we approach it critically? You've got to know something about the nature of the media first. I've got a list here. The list is generally what I call alternate media. You know all about mainstream media. You can turn on Channel 10 anytime you like. This provides a list of what I would regard as higher quality. Now what does that mean? Just because one person thinks it's higher quality, is it? I want to back it up with a certain argument. I've argued about the ABC and why it is not subject to commercial pressures. I mean, basically, private media organisations, they are concerned with getting big audiences. That pushes up the price per 30 seconds of advertising space. They don't care how they do that. If accurate news is not doing it, then they'll create what we call infotainment. So it's information, but it's filled with sort of more entertaining stuff like dogs stuck up in a tree or whatever. If that attracts more viewers than bombings in Syria, then we'll see lots of dogs in trees, you know. And I mean, I'm exaggerating, but that's overall the trend of the last 40 years of media. Led, absolutely, by Adelaide's homegrown boy, who started his career 2 blocks from here. Go that way down to the conference centre. That's where News Corporation was. Rupert Murdoch began there with his present from Daddy, a small newspaper. And you know, he was smart and he grew that into a worldwide empire. But Murdoch's formula was entertain people. Doesn't matter about accuracy. Fox News that Murdoch owns, 66% of the time, false or partly false. Okay?
So that's the one recently got fined from British. They released all those.
Yeah, he was spying on phones and so on. Sure.
That's the company, is it?
Yeah, and you know that stuff. Look, if you have a look at that stuff, what he was spying on the phones of the girl who was killed and the parents' phones. And, okay, that is all about personal stories, isn't it? And it's not the broader issue, like social issues and the broader pictures. It's this personal stuff. And, logos, ethos, pathos. It's that absolute maximisation of pathos in the communication that he's worked out attracts people. And therefore you can sell whatever you want to sell in the paper or the television program. You can sell it at 10 times the price that somebody who's maybe less exciting but more accurate. So, okay, one person does that, the others have to follow. If they don't follow, they die, don't they? Because Murdoch expands his market. It's just like anything. You get a more popular sausage, and unless other people copy it, that will dominate the market. So it's the same. Whether you sell sausages or whether you sell news information, capitalists don't care. It doesn't matter the object. It's the process. You have to accumulate and expand. If you don't expand, other people will and you'll die. It's the capitalist logic. So capitalism has been applied to information, and this is the result. This is what we see. Capitalism typically doesn't concern itself with quality. It's about quantification, maximising quantity. So quality, quantity notions are really useful critical thinking notions. What you see in the influence of capital tends to maximise quantity at the price of quality. That's a general trend that's been happening for like 200-300 years. If you think about pretty much anything, it gets quantitatively cheaper, but the quality tends to deteriorate for obvious reasons. If you privatise buses, are they going to put in beautiful soft seats? No, they're going to put in probably the cheapest seat that's just going to be okay for people to tolerate for half an hour, So there's always a drive to reduce quality. That's part of a reduction of price, which is obviously driving capital. Okay, same applies to news. You get we've seen an accelerating process of a reduction of quality. If you go back 40, 50 years, definitely newspaper articles were longer, more detailed, more well-researched. Today, you have much shorter pieces, headlines count much more, truth doesn't really matter so much because you're on to the next cycle anyway very quickly. There's this whole, what they call the spin cycle. It gets faster and faster. Okay, so certain corporations dominate that process, and if we look at another aspect of what's happened over the last, this article in Business Insider, so it's hardly a left-wing source, right? This is for the corporate class of Australia. I haven't got this on the Moodle yet, but I'm going to put it up because I've quoted these figures. They appear in lots of places, but here's a trustworthy source, I think. Back in 1983, so what's that, 93, 2003, so it's 32 years ago, 50 companies, there's a diagram here. I think these are US figures. Yeah, 90% of American media was controlled by 50 companies. That's already fairly concentrated. As we know, in capitalism, what happens is one successful Rupert Murdoch there and Disney there and Time Warner there. They've got very efficient marketing and business strategies. They outcompete the others. The big fish swallow the small fish. And pretty rapidly, 4 years ago, it's down to 6. So 90% of the media is owned by 6 corporations. That's pretty concentrated. That's as concentrated as if we took, my guess is, if we took the Soviet Union and communist countries, and we looked at the concentration of, information, there was, Pravda, and there was a youth communist paper, and there wasn't simply one media. I don't know, Pavel, how many were there? How many major media outlets in the Soviet Union? Was it simply one? Or was it split across about half a dozen?
No, obviously one.
Was it?
Of course it was governmental controlled.
Yeah. But didn't it then split into different, like a youth newspaper and a...
In the middle of 80s, after destroying all the communistic system, a lot of mass media resources appeared.
Ah, right, but only after the destruction. Okay, so it's not, okay, fair enough, so it's not as concentrated as that, but you're getting close. Now, if you look at the nature of those companies, there they are, the 6 companies of those. Now, the Australian media, a lot, I don't know the percentage, but it's very high. When Channel 10 want a story about Syria or a dog stuck up on a tree in Colorado or whatever, they don't go and film it themselves, they just buy it. Where do they buy it? They buy it from these corporations. So this flows on to our media. We're very, very dominated by so all the events in the world get funneled into this very small little pipeline that is shaped by those corporations. Now, if we take News Corp, that's Rupert Murdoch. So what have we got? General Electric. General Electric are one of the biggest arms manufacturers in the world. They produce lots of weaponry for the US. So what do you think their position on American foreign policy is going to be? And if there's events in the world, how do you think they're going to filter that information? Look it up if you don't believe me. Look up the history of General Electric, and their probably most of their money has come from Americans' arms production and high technology in the armaments industry. Murdoch, Disney, I've never heard of Viacom. Time Warner produced a lot of films, of course. CBS News, you might know. And you can see certain other companies like Pixar, we know the movie makers and so on. So, okay, if we look at one of those, Rupert Murdoch, what's he worth? He personally is worth $11 billion. News Corp is much more. I don't have the figure for News Corp, but you could find it. Okay, my point is, should we simply accept news from these sources as an accurate reflection of reality? I think, personally, I would answer my own question, clearly no, because these are not just, if we think of the 99% of people and the 1%, these are much less than the 1%, these are the 0.01%, but they control, 90% of the information. So how do you think our consciousness is getting shaped? I think I've thrown that quiz question at you before. Which war since 1996 has killed 5.4 million people? Who's heard of it? The war in the Congo. But are they just Africans? Within the framework of these corporations, they're just Africans. African lives are really quite molecular and unimportant compared to, what happens in the US or what happens in Europe, etc., etc. There's massive distortion. Okay, so I hope I've made my case. What I'm offering to you are some alternatives. And those alternatives range, obviously most of those ones, where would you locate them politically? Are they going to be centre, left, right?
They must be right.
They're going to be absolutely right, aren't they? They're not going to put out stuff on the whole that goes against their interests. Or, and a really key point, their advertisers' interests. So if there's some company advertising in News Corp, and News Corp runs a story that, those companies don't like, they get on the phone pretty quick. They say, well, we're not going to advertise with you, we'll switch our advertising to, Time Warner or someone else. So there's a lot of pressure, and clearly. So there's a lot of reshaping of what goes on. where do you find media that isn't like that? It's hard to find because it gets pushed right out to the side, of course.
Is that as you say, ABC is...
Yeah, the ABC would be our most immediate and obvious source, and we've explored some of those programs and sources. And I would say keep listening to something like the ABC because it is just not shaped by those interests. It is indirectly, broadly shaped in the sense that, you know, our state is part of a capitalist state, and it, you know, that tends to produce a certain kind of ideology around it. But it's much less direct. Look, community radio stations, they're small, but there's one in Adelaide called Radio Adelaide. I haven't got it in the list. But if you tune into Radio Adelaide, there's actually really good interviews with all sorts of people about local issues, but national and international issues. Can't remember, I'll look it up in a minute. But some of the best interviews about current affairs you find on community radio. Now, if you think of community radio, is that influenced by the dollar in any sense? Not really. It gets grants, small grants from the government, and then people who like the radio station join as members to support it. That's it. It's not shaped by the sort of things that we see here. Community 3CR is in Melbourne. Melbourne's one of the biggest cities, of course, and some of the best news you'll get from Radio 3CR.
John.
Australian public intellectuals, like Humphrey McQueen, for example, he's regularly interviewed on 3CR.
John.
Yeah.
You're talking about community radio is a quite good resource. As far as I know, they read the news. Is it from the newspaper?
Sometimes.
They're not resources
No.
themselves.
They have little...
It kind of
no, they have certain segments where they do read news.
Yeah.
But other segments, the community radio, a lot of the people do independent journalism, and then they network using the internet. And if somebody in Sydney has researched a union issue, they'll put it up on the database, and then somebody in Adelaide will get it. So as much as possible, they're maximising use of non-corporate media. So sure, there's some of that, what you say, but generally, they're trying to attract listeners. What's their point of attraction? Their point of attraction is to be different. So they're trying to get very different sources, generally, as much as they can. I mean, if you look just there, at random, interesting, bicycle users, environmental struggles in Australia, feminism. Just straight away, you can see where they are politically. It's a different kind of politics, isn't it? Decolonisation and the movement of people. As soon as you see the word decolonisation, you know, that's about supporting previous colonies to get independence. So clearly, there's a different focus. There's no political party behind it. It's just lots of different community groups who are concerned about social issues, say refugees, environment, women, whatever. They have like a women's show, a refugee show, an environmental show, whatever. Now, The Guardian is a big business newspaper. However, it's worked out, it originates in Britain, and it has worked out that there are quite a few people who are not interested in the big 5 corporations, or the big 6, and they're kind of centre-left. Have you come across The Guardian much? It's sort of a bit like, I'd put it kind of about where the ABC is. Maybe a little bit to the left of the ABC. You get good quality journalism, a lot of it's kind of English but reproduced here. But it's only about 2 years old. They've got an Australian version. I'd say probably most of what I find comes past me on Facebook, passed on from other people that is interesting, is from The Guardian. So I would recommend it. Have a read. And you get, again, you tend to get longer articles, more analytical. They will take you to a depth that a lot of stories on corporate media won't. we'll just go through here, Australian media, and I'll probably stop there and we'll do international media maybe next week. Do you know this word? Do you know that word, crikey? Australian slang. You drop a hammer on your foot, oh Christ! Right? You want to swear in a religious way. That's called blasphemy. It's a particular category of swearing. Blasphemy, when you swear about religious things, blasphemy. Okay, so in the past, I mean lots of people do that these days and no one has a problem. Well, not no one, some people do. But the majority of Australians certainly don't. And, but in the past, those sort of explanations got people into trouble, so they often change words a little bit, the ending. So instead of crikey, right? And then they're okay. They got themselves out of trouble. What about gee whiz? What were they going to say? Jesus. Oh golly. God. What are they?
That's
gonna,
crikey word.
right?
Aboriginal people use hips. Crikey girl.
Crikey, they use it a lot. Yeah, it's a fairly old-fashioned Australian word. Anyway, crikey, you'll find lots of good articles about Australia, and I think you can get a certain number per month free, and then they throw up a, subscribe. But most of what gets passed around Facebook I find I can get into. But yeah, there's stuff there, obviously about Malcolm Turnbull, and just, I guess what we're talking about here is kind of more intelligent media. Who do the intelligent, educated, middle class read? They tend to avoid those big six, including Murdoch, because, the 66% partly false figure is a problem, isn't it? Why do you want to read stuff where 2/3 of it's probably going to have some inaccuracy? So therefore, crikey is pretty high up on the list of kind of educated middle class reading. So that's basically what I've put here is, over the years, seeing stuff. New Matilda. Matilda, Waltzing Matilda, the Australian song. New Matilda, it's like the new Australia. So this is less daily news and more analytical stuff. So obviously stuff about Turnbull, saying, look, give it a few months. The green tactics, his climate change stuff, he won't move now. He'll consolidate his power, then we'll probably see, I'm guessing from the headline, then we'll probably see a little bit of a Green and Liberal Party, maybe. All right. So interesting analysis, predictions and so on.
Can we, when we get into the murder there, if we want to get into the new Matilda, we want to find the article we want, can we do that?
Sure, and one of the reasons I'm showing you these is because you're Australian public intellectual. I mean, think about it, these key top 40 influential thinkers are clearly going to feature on the dozen or so websites I'm showing you. They have been interviewed in the past, or there's stuff there now, or they will be. So this is where you could type in, for example, Jermaine Greer or Humphrey McQueen or Robert Mann, or your public intellectual. I would do this.
Don't understand.
You could.
No, I'm not working here.
No, I'm showing you so that you can do it in your own time. Obviously, once you find one of these resources, you like it, you want to keep coming back to it, you obviously don't have to go through the Moodle. You just type newmatilda.com, don't you, or you bookmark it yourself. I've just got this collection here to get you started on your own pathway, and hopefully you don't just use it for your essay, but over the next several, years, just as alternative information to this very narrow amount of information that we're getting. Look, John Pilger he's a journalist who basically couldn't get work in Australia because he was writing about international affairs, and he did work for Murdoch briefly, and they had a falling out, a conflict, and he went to England, and he's become one of Australia's most well-known journalists. He's got his own website, And you can see there he's got stuff on Cambodia, but he's written about Julian Assange. And this, I'd like to show one of his films later. It's called The Secret Country. It's about, he's written a lot on Aboriginal Australia. Yeah. Anzac, ISIS, you know, all sorts of stuff there. Green Left Weekly, some of you have looked at. That is a overtly political newspaper. But as I've mentioned, it's the most popular political website in Australia in terms of people coming for, if you want to get background stories. For example, Jeremy Corbyn, you know, the new Labor leader. You want to get a good background story that doesn't just look at the micro, but puts the whole thing in the perspective, like of the history of the Labor Party, whatever. You'll get a lot of good stuff there. Okay, here's an interesting one. The revolving door of Prime Ministers. We talked about this. Why so quickly do we get Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott, Turnbull? This revolving door. Okay, I haven't read the article, but here's the idea. Behind that, what's causing this? So in other words, trying to get down to that deeper structural level of analysis. You'll generally find the left tend to do that more. The conversation, so that's probably a fairly overtly left, and Pilger is too. The conversation is much more mainstream. The conversation is the sort of website that a lot of decision makers, a lot of public servants would read it, a lot of policy makers, high-level professionals, some business people, but it's more those concerned with, well, you can see, editors working with scientists, scholars and researchers. Pretty high intellectual content. And Michelle Grattan, she's often on the ABC. You might hear her over breakfast. She's often interviewed. All kinds of articles there. I guess the other thing about these sorts of things, these sorts of papers or papers on the web, you'll pick up a lot of Australian culture through reading these because they go into depth and background more than the average, you know, short little news story from the Murdoch press. There's more depth and background when you read, so just obviously over weeks, over months, you're going to pick up a lot of background about Australian culture by reading these papers rather than the Murdoch press. I'd say read both. I'd say read both because you want to see how Murdoch's treating things, but you want to be able to step outside that box as well. You want both. Left flank. That's a particular blogger. He's a psychiatrist in Sydney, who's a pretty interesting guy actually, and quite sophisticated and in-depth. He's writing a lot about Greece at the moment and so on. He's just won, Tad Tietze, his name is. I think Polish background. That's kind of fairly difficult, but it's there. Arena is a sort of cultural journal. Just got about 2 or 3 more Australian ones and then I'll hand it over to you to explore these. Yeah, it's political, cultural, and social, economic. There's a whole book launch on the intervention. There you are, Dilhani. Head over to that. When's that? September the 24th. Is that today? Tomorrow, 11:30 a.m.
Today is 21st.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we got 3 more days.
Yeah, so some interesting names there. Larissa Barrett, she's an Aboriginal lawyer. Yeah, so I bet it's in Melbourne. all the best sort of, you know, cultural events usually Melbourne. I think Arena is Melbourne based, I'm not sure. But yeah, look, lots of articles about all sorts of things there. Just get in and explore. But yeah, you know, I couldn't say what they're writing on, it's always changing. Links is also overtly left. It's there's a guy, Terry Townsend, in the Blue Mountains. He edits journals, newspapers from around the world. And some of you, if you're interested in international affairs and some Australian stuff, it's some of the best historical analysis. Just have to wait for that to load. I'll just talk about two more, because then we get to the end of